Tokyo Station, November 4th, 1921. Hara Takashi is a symbol of the New Japan. Born into a minor samurai family, as a young man he'd converted to Catholicism and opted to be classed as a commoner. Then, after a long career in public service, he became the first commoner and first Christian to become Prime Minister of Japan. During his tenure, Japan had finally stepped into a role among the world nations. He'd seen his country through the Paris Peace Conference, joined the League of Nations, intervened in the Russian Civil War, and built bridges with the business community. And though a conservative, he'd also discussed loosening Japan's harsh colonial rule in Korea. But all this gained him enemies. Enemies like the train station switchman, walking up to him now through the crowd. An ultra-nationalist angry at his moderation and international policy. Hara sees the knife, yet none of his achievements can save him. But before we continue, thank you so much to NordVPN for helping to make today's historical tale possible. Popular culture tends to pay a lot of attention to the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly the Nazis, but less so on the growth and development of militarism in Japan. When it is examined, militarism is generally looked at from the perspective of the United States, China, or the UK. And there's a lot of talk about the need for oil and rubber, but not a lot about the domestic issues. Which is unfortunate, since the story of Japan's capture by a military faction and march toward the Second World War is worth studying. Because unlike in German fascism, the Japanese militarists never managed to create a fully totalitarian state. In fact, until the end of the war, there were still political parties and opposition figures, though they were mostly terrified into silence, and the militarists were never able to take over the economy. But Japan's newly authoritarian government still had enough power over the state to plunge it into utter devastation, into a war with no clear strategy or objective, and without the consent of its civilian leadership. Now, before we dive in further, an interesting side note for those interested. This series will function as a sort of sequel to our End of the Samurai series, plus our Sun Yat-sen series deals with many of the same issues from the Chinese perspective. History! More crossovers than the MCU. Though it's, been around longer. Anyway, let's get started just after the Satsuma Rebellion. The Meiji Emperor has been restored to real power, the samurai and class system has been abolished, and Japan is governed by a council of elder statesmen in a period known as the Meiji oligarchy. But here's the thing about the Meiji state. It has no real political ideology other than one: advancement. Every step they take is geared toward modernizing the country, because they want parity with the powerful Western nations that they fear could colonize Japan like they have Southeast Asia, or carve it up like China. Their only chance, they felt, was to join those modernized nations and deal with them on equal footing, rallying behind the cry, enrich the country, strengthen the military. In just a few decades of hyper-fast development, they tackled industrialization, railroad building, innovative factories, compulsory public education, transition to a modern economy, and the founding of corporate combines. Dang, that's a lot. And that's just the short list. And of course, they poured money into creating a modernized army and a modernized fleet. The Meiji oligarchs also courted Western powers diplomatically, arguing that based on their rapid modernization and partial Westernization, they should renegotiate their unequal treaties foisted on the previous shogunate government, an effort that was ultimately successful. And some of these movements were beneficial for the populace. Japan was in the middle of a population explosion, especially in agricultural areas, and these expanded opportunities created jobs for children that wouldn't inherit farms. The reforms also gave a louder and louder voice to the common people and groups who had been advocating democracy and constitutional rule from the early days of the Restoration. And by 1881, the calls for a constitution could not be ignored. So the Meiji oligarchy went shopping in Europe for a system of government that would placate the reformers. The resulting Meiji Constitution of 1889 was a hybrid of the more absolutist Prussian constitution with the parliamentary elements of British and American models. The emperor would nominally be head of state, with an elected diet containing an upper and lower house. There were independent courts, a privy council for the emperor, and a nice advisory position for former statesmen to steer the emperor on policy. There were guaranteed rights of freedom of religion, trial before a judge, due process, and the right to petition the government. Not to mention, there were qualified rights like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, right to assemble and to associate with anyone, as well as the right to private correspondence and protections against unreasonable search. Sounds great, right? Well, this constitution also had problems. In fact, it was built to have problems. You see, all those qualified rights were conditional, essentially meaning the government could take them away at any time if they deemed it necessary for security. Oh, and those former statesmen who would advise the emperor? Yeah, they were the oligarchs. And while the Diet controlled legislation and budgets, and the Prime Minister ran the state, the Constitution essentially made the Emperor an absolute monarch. He could appoint peers and dismiss the House of Representatives. All branches of government, it said, were united in the Emperor. His power came not from the people, but from an unbroken line of succession from the divine sun goddess, Amaterasu. And the nation of Japan was not a government, but a family state, with the Emperor at its head. This political philosophy, known as kokutai, or national body, was assumed to be ancient and innate to Japanese culture. The idea argued by the largely conservative politicians who wrote this constitution was that political systems might come and go, but this sense of national unity, with the emperor at the top, was eternal. It's also an idea they started to push via the new public education system, as well as the military, which regularly drafted large numbers of young men. The result was that by the end of World War I, much of society accepted this idea of the emperor's central and divine role, even though this supposedly ancient philosophy was about a century old. It was a constitution meant to give the appearance of democracy, but with exploits the oligarchs and the emperor could use if things got too democratic. And the biggest exploit was this: the military was an independent branch, answerable to the emperor alone. It had no civilian control and could act independently in matters of war and peace. In the next few decades, the military would flex its muscle. In 1895, it defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1905, it crushed the Russian fleet in the Russo-Japanese War, becoming the first Asian nation to defeat a European empire, and in emulation of the great powers it intended to join, it scooped up colonial possessions in Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria, a strategically crucial area meant to guard Japan against threats from both China and Russia. Japan also emerged as a major winner after World War I. They walked out of the Paris Peace Conference running a German possession in China, Shandong, as well as a mandate to govern former German colonies in the Western Pacific. The wishes of the Meiji state had essentially been fulfilled, but not all was well. When the Meiji emperor died in 1912 and the country transitioned to his successor, Emperor Taisho, the military had demonstrated its power by forcing a constitutional crisis, refusing to send a member to the prime minister's cabinet, meaning it could not be formed. And as Western ideas and technology swept the country, and the big corporations, known as zaibatsu, became political kingmakers, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the government and increasing radicalization, especially as the rice riots swept the country in 1918. Political parties in the Diet became ever more polarized. On the left, socialists and communists wanted to solve the poverty of the countryside with collectivization. Democracy activists began to push for universal male suffrage, and would ultimately succeed. Meanwhile, ultra-nationalists on the right increasingly looked at these leftists and moderates as enemies to be fought with assassination and violence. Yet, despite these tensions, there was optimism, especially in port cities like Yokohama, the most westernized Japanese city. There, with its hotels and dance halls, East and West mingled, and new political and social ideas gestated. It was a city of art, innovation, and fun, a center for liberal ideas. And if you were standing there on the dock in 1923, waving at a massive Western cruise ship leaving port, you couldn't imagine what was coming. Until a sound like thunder. Until the ground went out from under you, the pier falling into the sea, spilling people and vehicles into the harbor. Until a 40-foot wall of water appeared on the horizon. The Great Kanto earthquake was about to remake Japan and signal a new era. Yokohama, September 1st, 1923. A city of liberal ideas, like labor unions, women's rights, and democracy. A city that smells of foreign delights, like chocolate and cigars. A city about to be destroyed. The ground shakes for 14 seconds, and in that time, most of the Western concrete buildings collapse, crushing hundreds. And though most traditional buildings are wood, soon fire rages through the city. Dazed survivors stagger around, coated in white dust. But it's not over. A 40-foot tsunami smashes into the coast. Ships are washed down streets and deposited on roofs. Then another wave follows, and another. The sea drowns or sweeps away thousands. Within minutes, Yokohama lays in almost total ruin, and the destruction continues inland to a place only 17 miles from the port city, Tokyo. The destruction rages on. In Tokyo, a city still made largely of wood and rice paper, buildings ignite into district-wide infernos. Fire brigades try to respond, but the tremors have broken all the pipes. In an apocalyptic scene, residents evacuate to a clear area beside a river, but the city around them is a firestorm, and the rising heat combines with the high winds to create a fire whirl the size of a tornado. Of the 140,000 killed, this one freakish accident will account for around 40,000 of them. And for a certain segment of the Japanese right wing, this was divine retribution for Japan flirting with Western ideas, allowing socialists and anarchists to operate and sabotaging the military's achievements abroad in Korea and China. In fact, in the aftermath of the earthquake, mobs hunted and murdered Koreans and anarchists in retribution for the destruction. Now, that might sound strange, but ultranationalist groups had been active in Japan for decades, including some who practiced paramilitary or intelligence activities. Two of the most prominent, the Black Ocean Society and the Black Dragon Society, were especially concerned with countering the threat from neighboring Russia and China. A decade earlier, they had entertained a more pan-Asian view, encouraging and sheltering Sun Yat-sen in the 1911 Chinese Revolution, but they increasingly saw Japan not just as the natural leader of the Asian nations, but its colonial master. And those who believed that military expansion was the key to national and economic security were known as militarists. But in the early 1920s, they were an extreme fringe, and there was no ultranationalist or militarist party in the Diet. Between 1912 and 1927, Japan entered a period of reform known as the Taisho democracy, named after the ruling emperor. And part of that opening of society involved the rise of political parties. Now, there were a lot of parties, but we're going to focus on two today: the conservative Sayukai, or Association of Friends of Constitutional Government, and the liberal Kensekai, or Constitutional Politics Association. You actually met the Sayukai last episode. It was the party of Hara Takashi, the prime minister assassinated in a Tokyo train station. They claimed to be liberal, but were really more of a center-right bureaucratic party, believing in big government, large public spending, and opposing social reform programs. They also flirted with the militarist and ultranationalist right, positioning themselves as pro-military and largely in favor of colonialist projects. The Kensekai, by contrast, was a center-left party who backed labor unions, supported economic reforms for farmers, and stood against the rule of oligarchs. Their biggest policy proposal was universal male suffrage. But they'd also been kept out of power by oligarch machinations, prevented from forming a government even when they won the majority. And because the conservative Sayukai held the majority from 1900 until just after Hara's assassination in 1921, you'd think the ultranationalists would be happy. Well, not so much. For these men, the moderate conservatives were almost as despised as the leftists. See, before Hara, the prime minister was usually a retired general or admiral and extremely friendly to the military. Ultranationalists also hated how Japan had joined the League of Nations after World War I. They thought it was a policy that did nothing but restrain Japan from acting decisively and unilaterally in its own interest. They argued that Hara hadn't even gotten the Paris Peace Conference signatories to affirm a statement of racial equality among the members. The UK and US shot it down. For a period, the ultranationalists got excited at the prospect of the Siberian intervention, when Japan joined a multinational force attempting to stabilize the Russian Civil War. The army had hoped to keep Siberia, fashioning it into a buffer state against Russia. But Hara shot that plan down, and when he brought Japanese forces home, the military's perspective was that it wasted 5,000 men without gaining anything. But even after Hara's assassination by an ultranationalist sympathizer, he left them with one final indignity. He'd already dispatched a representative to the Washington Naval Conference. In an agreement meant to stop a naval arms race, Japan agreed to limit its navy to a size that Japanese admirals considered insufficient to defend Japan and its colonies. Sure, it was true that China was so divided by warlords at the time, it couldn't mount a naval threat. But the United States had several colonies and naval bases in the Central and Western Pacific. Though that wasn't their biggest worry. It was actually Soviet Russia that scared the ultranationalists most. It was big, powerful, and in one place, only 28 miles from the Japanese home islands. Plus, Russia posed an ideological threat. While Japan had already suppressed the Japanese Communist Party and driven it underground around the turn of the century, ultranationalists always feared it would rise again, especially after 1923, when a communism-influenced student tried to assassinate Crown Prince Hirohito. Revolution, it seemed, was in the air. In 1918, riots over the price of rice had exploded across the country, leading to popular violence, labor strikes, and even the bombing of police stations. Plus, the Siberian intervention made things worse, as the government bought stocks of rice to supply its troops. And then, in 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake wrecked both Yokohama and Tokyo. This necessitated a massive rebuilding effort that sucked up government funds, while meanwhile, inflation was squeezing the urban class. And that economic difficulty and the dissent it caused helped promote liberal opposition parties like the Kensekai, which won enough seats in 1924 to create a hung parliament and a three-party ruling coalition with the Sayukai. But given how much they had to compromise, the Kensokai's reform plan had to stay moderate. They passed universal male suffrage in 1925, hoping to move the country away from the oligarchs, and passed some economic bills. Yet under pressure from their allies, that same year, they also passed the Public Security Prevention Law. This allowed the government to jail anyone for 10 years if they formed or joined an association aimed to alter the Kokutai, the national body with the emperor at its head, or act against private property. Now, it was clearly aimed at communists and socialists, but considering its vague language, could come to be used on anyone. But while they had to compromise in the Diet, the Kensokai could push a more liberal platform in foreign relations. As foreign minister, the liberal Kijuro Shidehara defined Japanese diplomacy in the 1920s, pursuing amicable relations with Britain and the United States, and non-intervention in China. When trouble occurred, he usually evacuated Japanese citizens rather than sending troops. Even as Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, who the ultra-nationalists considered a Russian puppet, consolidated control in China, Shidehara stayed out of it. He refused to join with allied nations in threatening retaliation when Chiang's forces attacked several embassies. But Shidehara's hesitation to use troops, and the government cutting the army by 4 divisions, angered both the military and the public. Some ultranationalist and junior military officers even started to go as far as saying parliamentary government was un-Japanese. And then, financial panic hit. After the Great Kanto earthquake, the government had offered earthquake bonds to the big banks at a massively discounted rate. The idea being they could lend money to help with the rebuilding. But then by 1927, Japan was in an economic slowdown, and the government floated, making those bonds come due. The result was financial crisis. Citizens made a run on banks, withdrawing their money. Smaller banks collapsed overnight, leaving the market controlled by the big Zaibatsu corporations, many of which had political or family links to members of the Kensokai. Shidehara, for example, was married to a daughter of the man who founded Mitsubishi. It was not a good look, and the prime minister was forced to resign. His Sayukai successor, a general, lost no time in rolling back the tide of liberalism. Within a year, he'd used the Public Security Preservation Law to arrest thousands of known and suspected communists across Japan, and planned for a more aggressive interventionist stance in China. It was a new era, quite literally, because the next year, a new emperor, Hirohito, came to the throne, beginning the Showa period, and radicals in the Imperial Japanese Army would start taking matters into their own hands. Manchuria, June 4th, 1928, 5:20 a.m. A train speeds through the darkness in the last few minutes before the dawn. Inside sits Chinese warlord Zhang Zolin, a former bandit. He is master of Manchuria, and until last month, the dictator of the Republic of China. But he's running now, ousted when the nationalist generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his northern expansion forced him out of the capital. Humbled, he returns to the territory he squeezed to financial collapse, intent on fulfilling his dream of holding Beijing. For the first time in months, Chiang is safe. His men guard this railway, apart from the portion where it crosses the Southern Manchurian Railroad, controlled by his ally Japan, and he can see the crossing bridge quickly approaching. Soon he'll be in his capital and plotting his comeback. An explosion on the tracks rips the train car nearly in half. 2 of Chiang's generals die in front of him, and he himself is mortally wounded. The grisly work of a bomb planted by his allies in the Japanese army. Now, you might have noticed for a series on Japanese militarism, so far we've mostly talked about civilian politics. And there's a good reason for that. Because to understand how the tail started to wag the dog in Japanese government, we first have to really understand the dog. And while we spent last episode talking about political parties and factionalism, today we're going to be talking about more factionalism. Because every organization we discuss in this series, the military included, was just a Russian doll of factions. For example, the Japanese Army and Navy had fundamentally different versions of territorial expansion. The Navy wanted to expand south into China and Southeast Asia as a way to counter a possible naval war with the United States, while the Army, by contrast, thought the key was to dominate Manchuria, which would give it a buffer against both the Soviet Union and the increasingly unified China, and allow Japan to directly extract natural resources it otherwise had to gain through foreign trade. But even within the army, there were also factions. For instance, a radical group known as the Imperial Way faction, mostly made up of junior officers like lieutenants, captains, and colonels from the countryside, preached an abolishment of civilian government and a restoration of the emperor as the sole political power. They wanted Japan to go back to the period of its glory, with a revered emperor and loyal samurai, and without the corruptions of party politics, big corporations, industrialization, and commercialism. Now, if you've seen our other series on the Sengoku Jidai and the end of the samurai, you realize this period never really existed. They were hearkening back to an imaginary past. Their rivals were the Control faction, who wanted to work within the current system, but like the Imperial Way, also saw military expansion into Manchuria and China as the solution to Japan's economic, political, trade, and population difficulties. But they also believed in more modernization and industry than the Imperial Way did, and largely strived to get Japan in a position to preemptively strike and defeat the Soviet Union. But both of these factions detested civilian government, which they saw as westernized, corrupt, and beholden to the Zaibatsu, the large corporations that backed parties and candidates. However, it should be noted that the Control faction also believed the Zaibatsu were a key ingredient in Japan's war machine. Of these groups, a small sub-faction believed that if they could force an international crisis and get the military into combat, then they could take the reins away from the civilian leaders. This, they believed, would serve both country and emperor. And most of those plots centered on an area that was then called Manchuria, a term we're going to use for clarity's sake, but just know that name has some baggage attached to it that we'll definitely discuss in our Lies episode. Anyway, in 1905, one of the spoils Japan had acquired during the Russo-Japanese War was the South Manchuria Railway, cutting through northeastern China. Control of this railway had given Japan access to the many raw materials it needed to import from China and Mongolia, and the corridor around the rails had been developed heavily by the Zaibatsu, with factories and towns for Japanese workers. Plus, a large Japanese force, the Kwantung Army, guarded these interests against Chinese warlords and local bandits. But the militarist factions wanted more. They wanted all of Manchuria, which is where Chang Zolin comes in. See, the Kwantung Army wanted to split governance of Manchuria with him, but he seemed poised to either open Manchuria to trade with the US and Britain, or else lose control to the Russian-backed Shang, who might set up a Soviet puppet state. So, a group of junior officers decided to assassinate him, and either install a more competent warlord, or provoke a full Japanese invasion and take direct control. But the plot backfired. They never told their senior officers about it, and the Kwantung Army simply wasn't ready to invade. Plus, when it leaked that the Japanese army officers had planted the bomb, the civilian government was furious, and Japan's image tarnished on the world stage. Then Chang's son came to power, and in retaliation, handed Manchuria to Shang. The military, for their part, stonewalled the Prime Minister's investigation into the explosion. And when the Prime Minister reported this to Emperor Hirohito, a few careless, displeased words from the monarch meant it was the Prime Minister who ended up resigning. The Kwantung Army had, essentially, proved it could act unilaterally and without approval or oversight of the civilian government, and suffer zero consequences. And to Hirohito, who had not actually wanted the Prime Minister to resign, it was a sign that he shouldn't insert himself into politics. Meanwhile, the economy took a dive. Japan had barely clawed its way out of financial panic when the Great Depression laid it low. The country survived on agricultural and textile exports, particularly silks, and now prices for those goods fell dramatically. So to keep in business, factories tried to make up for this by producing more, leading to an oversupply problem, all while families starved in the countryside. The Liberal Party in power, the Minseto, took deep political damage as well. A successor of the Kensekai, their financial policies only worsened the situation. This in turn radicalized large segments of the population who, primed by school curriculums and military service, bought into arguments that civilian government had failed and been corrupted by the Zaibatsu. The military, voters increasingly thought, was Japan's last pure institution. The Minseto became a further target of rage due to its foreign policy. They backed diplomatic engagement with the United States, which had just banned all Asian immigrants angering the Japanese public, along with non-engagement in China. They also cut military budgets. But the last straw was the signing of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which the Navy claimed undermined Japan's maritime defense and usurped the emperor's power as commander-in-chief. Calls for radical action proliferated, which was increasingly dangerous, as Japan had a long history of authorities excusing political violence if it was spontaneous and the attacker's motives were considered sincere. And as we saw with Chang's assassination, those in power were hesitant to punish bad actors if they claimed patriotic motives or said they acted to protect the emperor and further the national interest. In November of 1930, an ultranationalist belonging to an anti-communist group shot and wounded the Minseto prime minister at Tokyo Station, not far from where Hara had been killed. The conservative Sayukai Party then used the wounded prime minister's inability to come into the Diet as pretext for claiming he couldn't govern. The prime minister died the next year. Then in March of 1931, A group of junior officers called the Cherry Blossom Society, so named because they said the life of a soldier was fleeting like a cherry blossom, tried to spark riots that would instigate martial law, paving the way for a coup. But said riots were badly organized and failed. To avoid repercussions, the general, who they'd planned to make prime minister, hushed the incident up, and again, no one was punished. But that was mere prelude to another plot, a rail bombing, just like back in 1928. September 18th, 1931, South Manchuria Railway. Quietly, the lieutenant lays bundles of blasting powder by the train tracks. The plan, devised by a colonel and lieutenant colonel, is this: blow the railway, attract Chinese troops from a nearby barracks, blame the blast on them, and invade in retaliation. He backs off, hears the train coming, and detonates. Unaware, the train speeds toward the damaged area of track, hits it, sways, and continues on, never knowing it passed the epicenter of a new and bloody war. The explosives, it turns out, were too far from the tracks to cause much damage. But that doesn't matter, and the charade goes on. The next day, Japanese artillery fires on the Chinese garrison in retaliation, and 500 soldiers cross into Chinese territory. Suddenly, as planned, Japan is at war, and in Tokyo, the military coup will come within weeks. Manchuria, September 19th, 1931, 11:48 a.m. Tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. The sake is good, the hotel is comfortable, the geisha is dancing. General Tatekawa is enjoying himself. Who knew this last-minute assignment to Manchuria would be so relaxing? Tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Yesterday, his bosses in the army ministry had found out something was afoot in Manchuria, a plot by insubordinate members of the Kwantung Army to start a war with China. So Tatekawa had been rushed from Tokyo to Kwantung Army headquarters in order to quash it. But when he got there, he told the leaders that his message from Tokyo could wait until tomorrow. After all, Tatekawa himself thought a war with China might not be so bad. Hey, could anyone recommend a good hotel? So he passed out drinking last night and carried on partying this morning. The geisha dances, the shamisen plays. The music nearly covers the sound of gunfire, the sound he's pretending he can't hear. Tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, tat-tat-tat. Japan's civilian government didn't take the Kwantung Army's invasion of Manchuria lying down. In truth, it was more like gradually reclining. The prime minister learned about the troop movements from the newspapers. He didn't know what to tell the ambassadors when they called, and the Kwantung Army was not responding to his messages, telling them to stop and asking for updates. And who ordered this anyway? He definitely wasn't going to tell the foreign leaders he couldn't control his own military. He contacted one of the grand men of state, the last of the oligarchs, to try to get him to lobby someone, perhaps the emperor. No response. But this undeclared war was getting bigger. China had 200,000 troops in Manchuria, and the Kwantung Army was no match for that. So within days, generals ordered Japanese reinforcements in Korea to cross into Manchuria. Soon the government assented to sending more troops from Japan itself. And there was another problem. The public loved it. War fever entered full swing. People started wearing kimono liners printed with tanks and fighter aircraft, and flocked to cinemas to see newsreels of the combat. As far as the public was concerned, Japan was finally taking an active hand. After all, a lot of Japanese soldiers had died in World War I and the Russo-Japanese War to gain possessions in Manchuria, making it to them a graveyard of heroes. Further propaganda, much of it laid by the military, positioned Manchuria's natural resources as necessary to Japan's economy, though modern scholarship has suggested this was never the case. After all, who do you think was making all those newsreels everyone was watching? Yep, the army. Anyone who stood against the war was punished. Newspapers that criticized the Kwantung Army were subject to low sales or boycotts, politicians took note, and felt like they could do nothing. But it wasn't just public opinion they were afraid of. In October of 1931, less than a month into the war, young officers informed their superiors that members of the Cherry Blossom Society had concocted another plot to overthrow the government. They would take command of a group of aircraft and bomb the prime minister's cabinet meeting, decapitating the civilian government. Then, a troop uprising would capture government buildings, and they'd force the emperor, at gunpoint if necessary, to take power. Generals arrested the plotters and gave their ringleader the harsh punishment of 20 days house arrest. Yeah, many other officers got 10 days, while some were merely transferred. It was mostly kept quiet and treated like an internal matter, which is not a big deterrent, right? Well, that was part of the problem. As we discussed last episode, there was a hesitation to punish these types of actions, partially because this was just a more extreme version of the nationalist message the government itself pushed, but also because these acts were seen as gaikokujo, a sort of patriotic insubordination, an idea that when things are wrong in Japan, idealistic men will sometimes do rash, rebellious, and self-sacrificial things to try to put things right. Like murder a politician or invade a country. And that while these actions were not exactly kosher, they still should be admired. Now, at one time, historians tried to explain this reactionary violence, and the public excusing it, entirely through the lens of Japanese culture. But there are other factors. For example, Japan's public education system, where most students dropped off after 6th grade, and even more after 8th. Only a few fully graduated, and even fewer went to college. Meaning in the troubled 1920s and 30s, most of the public lacked the tools to understand the complicated web of political, diplomatic, and economic forces now shaping their lives. And in the absence of that understanding, many people turned to conspiracy theories to explain their world and supported extreme, often violent solutions to fix it. February 1932, Tokyo. This is their motto: one man, one kill. Lay preacher Nishio Inoue teaches an unusual creed. Combining Buddhist thought with Japanese nationalism, he urges the complete overthrow of the modern political and economic order. As a young man, he drifted until ending up in Manchuria, working on the railroad and as a paid informant for the military. There, he says he had mystical experiences telling him that Japan must be renewed. He's drawn up a list of 20 names: liberal politicians, moderates, heads of corporations, and 20 volunteers, some civilian radicals, others naval officers, come forward to receive their assignments, along with the gift of a Browning automatic pistol. They take a blood oath to fulfill their duty, which is why the press will come to call them the League of Blood. February 9th. A former finance minister and major player in the liberal Minzato party steps out of his car to give a speech at a school. A League member guns him down. March 5th. The Director General of Mitsui Bank is walking into the building when a League member draws a pistol and murders him. After their arrests, neither assassin is quiet about who directed them, and Nishio Inoue turns himself into a Tokyo police station 6 days later. But despite his imprisonment, naval officers associated with the group are planning something even bigger. May 15th. In his residence, Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyashi is worried. His predecessor had to resign over a failure to control the military, and though the emperor ordered him to restrain the militarists, nothing Inokai says seems to stop them. Plus, in January, the military had attacked Shanghai, China's largest city, over a deeply shoddy pretext. And when he tried to negotiate a solution with the Chinese, he'd gotten called a traitor for it. Now the Kwantung Army had declared a new Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, Manchukuo, and invited the deposed Chinese emperor to rule it. Inokai refused to recognize its legitimacy. Suddenly, outside the door, there's a scuffle. Shouts. 11 naval officers enter. They're young, no more than 20, and carrying pistols. "If we could just talk," Inokai says, "I could make you understand." The leader raises his gun. Dialogue is useless. They open fire. Like Inoue's League of Blood assassins, they're caught immediately. But that's the plan, because both groups will use their own trials as propaganda. It's a media circus. When the judge tries to decide the case against Inoue and his 2 assassins based on facts, they whip up a publicity campaign, saying he's secretly a communist sympathizer with anti-Japanese views. Badgered in the press and mentally exhausted, the judge declares himself unfit and gives up the case. The new judge, a right-wing admirer of Inoue, lets him use the trial as a platform to spread his message to all of Japan. He allows Buddhist clergy allied with Inoue to testify that his actions with the League of Blood were spiritually pure and patriotic. At sentencing, the judge publicly states that he regrets having to give them life in prison and suggests the emperor might give them amnesty. The trial of Inukai's assassins is even more fevered. 110,000 people write or sign letters in their own blood saying the defendants should be released. 9 young men offer to die instead of the plotters and show their commitment by sending their severed little fingers to the court. The judge, intimidated by what happened at the League of Blood trial, lets the killers expound on their motives. Comments the newspapers then print and disseminate verbatim without comment. In military courts, the officers are charged not with murder, but rebellion. Defense attorneys argue that loyalty to the emperor is the basis of the law, and given their pure motives, to punish them harshly would undermine the emperor and Japanese spirit. A Navy prosecutor isn't buying it. He goes after them hard, argues for the death penalty. After all, he says, motives shouldn't matter. Murder is murder. And if the court doesn't punish these men, it will only encourage more political violence. And he was right. Because the naval court didn't listen, it gave the assassins only 15 years in prison, and the prosecutor, by contrast, was forced under public pressure to resign from the Navy. It was, as one British reporter said, a case of government by assassination. And it wasn't over, not by a long shot. League of Nations General Assembly, Geneva, Switzerland, February 24, 1933. Everyone knows this vote will be tense. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the League of Nations had tasked British politician Lord Lytton to investigate the circumstances of what's increasingly become known as the Mukden Incident. The Lytton Commission's report ascribes blame on both sides, but it also says that the Kwantung Army had not acted in self-defense and calls the puppet state of Manchukuo illegitimate. Japanese troops should withdraw. Now the League of Nations votes to condemn Japan as the aggressor. 42 votes in favor, 2 opposed. And in response, Japanese Ambassador Matsuoka steps up to the podium. Japan, however, he says, finds it impossible to accept the report conducted by the assembly. He then walks down the aisle and exits the hall, followed by the Japanese delegation. They've just withdrawn from the League of Nations. When Japan quit the League of Nations in 1933, it abandoned the most prominent international organization meant to guard against a new world war. And they weren't the only ones. That November, the new German Chancellor Adolf Hitler held a successful referendum on withdrawing from the League. And in 1937, fascist Italy quit when the League condemned its actions in what is now Ethiopia. In honesty, Japan had long been frustrated with the League, arguing that it treated Asian nations differently from those of Europe or North America. They'd condemned Japanese actions in Manchuria, but happily let Britain and France set up colonial puppet states of their own in the Middle East. But even in direct diplomatic talks, Japanese ambassadors did themselves no favors by hiding the fact that their military was out of control. It saved Japan from looking weak and divided, sure, but as diplomats increasingly made assurances to foreign nations, only to have the military violate them, it made Japan appear untrustworthy and deceptive. The result was that Japan diplomatically isolated itself, removing all leverage on the world stage and leaving the government no tools to enact its foreign policy apart from one: military action. So, bereft of allies, Ambassador Matsuoka pioneered an anti-communist pact with the fascist states of Germany and Italy. Yet despite all that, things in Japan were kinda quiet. For 2 years, not much progressed. There were no domestic or international incidents, and the economy improved, though unrest still simmered. A corruption scandal brought down the prime minister in 1934, leading to further dissatisfaction with civilian rule. And in 1935, a factional dispute between officers at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy formed the prelude of what would come next. It happened like this. When military authorities uncovered a group of young officers plotting a coup at the academy, they expelled them and forced the Inspector General of Military Education, a prominent Imperial Way faction leader, into retirement. Then, when he was replaced by a general who led the rival Control faction, Imperial Way officers took it as evidence that the whole crackdown had been a setup. In retaliation, an Imperial Way officer walked into the general's office and murdered him with a sword. The killer's trial once again inflamed the public and convinced the Imperial Way that it was finally time to move against their enemies. The February 26th incident, Tokyo, 1936, 4 a.m. They called themselves the Righteous Army, gathering in the snowy barracks grounds, showing a postage stamp to indicate they're in on the plot. These are young and excited men. Their plan is to restore the emperor to power. With a rallying cry adapted from the old Meiji Restoration slogan, "Revere the Emperor, destroy the traitors." They assemble, nearly 1,600 strong, and march into the city center. At 5 a.m., they attack multiple targets simultaneously: key buildings, moderate and liberal politicians, and their enemies, the Control faction, especially those who signed the Washington Naval Treaty. They besiege the Prime Minister's residence, shooting it out with police officers. And once through, they murder the Prime Minister and use a photo to confirm their kill. Confirming, of course, that they killed the wrong man. Only days later, they'll learn that their target had escaped and they'd actually killed his brother-in-law. They also storm the Finance Minister's house and kill him in his bed. They shoot an Imperial advisor, a former Prime Minister, in front of his wife. Then they board a truck and head to the house of the new Inspector General of Military Education, the replacement for the Control faction general murdered in the Military Academy incident, and machine gun him as his young daughter hides behind a table. They ransack a liberal newspaper, seize the Ministry of War, and take control of police headquarters. More assassination squads storm houses, but the occupants manage to slip away, and the group trying to take control of the palace doesn't succeed. The rebels then make their demands known: an Imperial Wei-dominated cabinet, a full restoration of imperial power, and their leader, previously forced into retirement, instated as prime minister. But when Emperor Hirohito is informed, he's unequivocal. The plot must be crushed now. For 2 days, there's a flurry of negotiation. The rebels receive statements of support from some ministers, but the winds are changing. The emperor is firm that this must end, with force if necessary. By the morning of the 29th, rebels in the capital look out to see themselves surrounded by 20,000 loyalist troops and 40 warships in Tokyo Bay. Airdropped pamphlets blow in the wind, each saying the emperor has ordered them to stand down. Every radio airwave repeats this same message, and an enormous balloon carries a banner telling them not to resist. They give up. With the emperor publicly against them, they could not claim to be acting in his interest. It turned out all Hirohito had to do to stop this madness was speak up, a thing he could have done after any of the previous incidents or any that happened afterward. And yet, he didn't. No public trials this time. No soapbox to spread radicalism. The leaders are tried behind closed doors and shot without media present. Imperial Way officers are purged from the army or sent to inglorious far-off postings. But militarism only got stronger. On March 9th, the Prime Minister's cabinet, terrified, disgraced by their inability to prevent the chaos, and unable to function, resigned, which paved the way for a cabinet stacked with former, and for the first time, current military officers. By threatening to resign and not appoint new members, the military could make any prime minister fall. It effectively held veto on all policy, and its hold over the government would only grow stronger. The next year, on July 7, 1937, Japanese troops stationed outside of Beijing got into a confused nighttime encounter with a Chinese city garrison. Shots were exchanged, and when negotiations failed, both sides called for reinforcements. Tensions mounted. At 4:45 on July 8th, at a place known as Marco Polo Bridge, Chinese units fired on massing Japanese forces for an unknown reason. In response, 5,000 Japanese troops attacked, and the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. And it wouldn't end until 1945, at which point it had merged with the Second World War and killed around 22 million people. But the Japanese government got a preview of that in 1937, when it began to hear sickening reports of troops carrying out an unprecedented civilian massacre after taking Nanjing. But for the Japanese government, the problems went beyond an increasingly unaccountable military. Because while both military factions had wanted war with China, neither had a strategic plan for how or what to do with it. Their doctrines were ideological positions, not military aims. They had no objective of when to stop, no strategy of how to hold and administer what they seized. The promised resources meant to secure and enrich Japan went right back into the war effort. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Japan scooped up its colony in Indochina. In retaliation, the United States placed an embargo on steel and petroleum, the most necessary raw materials in modern war. So then, desperate for war materials, Japan moved on the British and Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia in order to secure their resources. They would supply their war by starting new wars. To cloak the action in idealism, Japan announced it would liberate the nations of Asia from colonialism and lead them in a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In reality, it was a license to replace Western colonialism with their own. In 1940, all political parties dissolved, consolidated into the Imperial Rule Assistance Association as a way to combat factionalism. It officially joined the Axis powers and began working toward a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Japanese politics, from the village level, were reorganized to support total war. And fearing attack by the United States, while the military was already so tied down, a group of officers began formulating a plan to break America's naval power in the Pacific. Which, of course, is a story so large it has to be its own Extra History Complete, which is coming later this year. And if you've been enjoying watching all of this extra content and corrections these mega episodes have to offer as much as we've loved crafting them, then please also give a thank you to today's sponsor, NordVPN, for helping to make this series possible. Now, if you've been on the internet for like a second, you probably know how important a VPN is, right? The best of which being NordVPN, which I was actually using before they were working with us, so this is all very serendipitous. And that is for a few reasons. To start with, Nord is easy to use. One click and you're protected online via their next generation encryption, shielding you from malware, trackers, and ads. Not to mention, NordVPN notifies you if someone scraped your credentials and then put them on the dark web. And it is fast, like one of the fastest VPNs on the planet. Case in point, I was on a recent trip, and I was worried that I wouldn't be able to watch season 4 of The Bear right when it dropped. I need my Carmi. But with NordVPN, not only was I able to keep up with every single chaotic cousin, but even while linked back to my home region, the connection was fast enough where I was streaming in HD no problem. Plus, NordVPN has apps for all major platforms, one account can protect up to 6 different devices, and they never track or share anything you do online with anyone, meaning your secrets are secure. So for protection, privacy, and a great deal on NordVPN, all you gotta do is use our link below or scan the QR code right here. Then you'll get an exclusive deal on NordVPN for extra next-generation protection, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee, meaning you got nothing to lose. So again, head here to protect yourself with all of the perks of NordVPN, and then once you are sure you are secure, check out our next episode here. So there was that one time that Angelo Valenciana, Benjamin Daniels, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Zeliad's Architectures were awesome legendary patrons, but guess what? It's still happening.